The sound of a hammer striking wood echoed across the town square of Clearwater, Wyoming. November 1874. The air bit cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Silas McKenna sat astride his gray mare at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping the reins with the same tightness he'd used to grip the shovel 3 years ago when he buried his wife and daughter. He'd come to town for flour and coffee, nothing more. He hadn't planned on stopping, hadn't planned on staying. But the sound of that hammer made him pause, and the sight before him made his blood run cold. 7 children stood on a wooden platform in the center of the square, leather collars around their necks, hands bound with rope, eyes cast downward like animals who'd learned that looking up only brought pain. The oldest was a boy, maybe 13, with dark hair and a scar running down his left cheek, like someone had tried to split his face in half and failed. The youngest were twin girls 4 years old, at most clutching each other's hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Between them stood 5 others. A wild-looking boy with eyes that darted like a cornered animal, a girl of 9 who kept her arm around a smaller boy who coughed every few seconds, each cough sounding wet and wrong. Another girl, maybe 8, who stood perfectly still and stared at nothing, seeing everything and nothing at once. Judge Cornelius Sterling stood beside the platform, his round face flushed with excitement and whiskey. He wore a black suit that strained against his belly and a gold watch chain that caught the weak November sun. His voice boomed across the square with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who'd done this before. $50 for the blonde one. A man in the front row thrust his hand up. He owned the silver mine 20 miles north. Silas knew him, knew the mine worked children until they broke. 60, another voice. The foreman from the timber mill. Judge Sterling's gavel rose and fell like an executioner's blade. $60 for the girl. Do I hear 70? Silas watched the girl in question. She couldn't have been more than 9. She held the sick boy closer, as if her thin arms could protect him from what was coming. The boy with the scar, the oldest, lifted his head then. His eyes swept the crowd with a hatred so pure it could have melted the snow. When his gaze landed on Silas, it held for a moment. A question in those eyes, or maybe a challenge. Then he looked away. Sold $60 to Mr. Peterson? The hammer fell. The crowd surged forward. Money changed hands. The foreman grabbed the girl's arm. She screamed. The sick boy she'd been holding started to cough, then sob. The oldest boy lunged forward, his bound hands reaching for his sister or brother, or whoever she was to him, but a deputy's hand clamped down on his shoulder and shoved him back. That's when Silas understood what he was watching. Not an auction for land or livestock, an auction for children. Something inside him, something he thought had died 3 years ago in a cold bedroom that smelled like medicine, and death suddenly woke up. It felt like anger. It felt like shame. It felt like the ghost of his wife Sarah standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice in his ear saying what she always said when she saw injustice. Do something. Silas dismounted. His boots hit the frozen ground with purpose. The crowd parted as he walked through them, not because they feared him, but because something in his face told them to move or be moved. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform. Judge Sterling looked up, surprise flickering across his fleshy face, before settling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Silas McKenna. Didn't expect to see you in town. Thought you were still hiding out on that ranch of yours. How much for all of them? Silas's voice came out flat. Final. The crowd went silent. Sterling blinked. Excuse me. All 7? How much? A laugh rippled through the crowd. Sterling's smile widened into something that might have been amusement, or might have been calculation. Silas, these children need to be placed in proper homes. Homes where they'll be useful, where they'll earn their keep. You're a single man, living alone on a failing ranch. You can barely take care of yourself, much less 7 mouths. I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked for a price. Sterling's smile faded. His eyes narrowed. $500 each. The crowd gasped. $3,500. More money than most men in Wyoming saw in 5 years. More money than the children were worth by any measure except cruelty. Silas reached into his coat. The leather saddlebag he pulled out was heavy. Worn smooth by years of use, he'd been saving for 3 years. Saving for nothing in particular, just saving because that's what you did when you stopped living and started existing. He opened the bag and poured the contents onto the platform. Gold coins hit the wood with a sound like rain on a roof. They rolled and scattered and caught the light. The crowd pressed forward. Sterling's eyes went wide. "That's $4,000, Silas said. "For all 7, now." Sterling stared at the gold. His tongue darted out, wetting his lips. A man like Sterling could do a lot with $4,000. A man like Sterling could disappear a lot of sins with that much gold. But Sterling was also a man who didn't like being challenged, especially not in public, especially not by a broken-down rancher who everyone knew was half dead himself. "The law says these children must be placed with families who can provide for them," Sterling said slowly, "who can offer them education and discipline and a proper Christian upbringing. You're not married, Silas. You live like a hermit. You haven't set foot in a church since your wife died. How do I know you won't work these children to death? How do I know you're not just looking for free labor?" The boy with the scar spoke then. His voice was rough, like he'd swallowed gravel. "He's lying." Every head turned. The boy stared at Sterling with those hate-filled eyes. "You don't care about proper homes. You sell us to whoever pays. The man who bought my brother last year worked him in a mine until he couldn't walk. He was 9 years old. You knew you didn't care." A deputy moved forward, but Sterling raised his hand. "Boy, you're speaking out of turn. My name is Thomas Reed, and you're a liar and a thief, and everyone here knows it." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, because the boy was right, and they all knew it. They'd all seen it. The orphan trains had been coming through Wyoming for years, dropping off children like cargo, and men like Sterling had been profiting from their misery for just as long. Sterling's face went red. "You ungrateful little wretch! I should have you whipped for that mouth. Touch him, and you'll answer to me." Silas's voice was quiet. "Deadly." Sterling turned back to Silas. Something ugly moved behind his eyes. "You want them, fine. Take them. But mark my words, McKenna, I'll be watching. One misstep, one complaint, one sign that you're not providing proper care, and I'll have them taken from you so fast your head will spin. The law gives me that right. As judge of this county, I have the authority to remove children from unsuitable homes." "Then we understand each other." Silas began gathering the gold, placing it back into Sterling's greedy hands. "They're mine now, legally purchased. That makes them my responsibility, not yours." Sterling counted the coins with shaking fingers. When he finished, he nodded to the deputies. "Remove their bindings." The ropes came off. The leather collars unbuckled and fell to the platform with soft thuds. The children stood there, rubbing their wrists, looking at Silas with expressions that ranged from suspicion to terror to nothing at all. "Come on," Silas said. He didn't wait to see if they followed. He climbed down from the platform and walked toward his wagon. The boy named Thomas was the first to move. He gathered the others with quick, quiet words. The girl who'd been holding the sick boy picked him up, though he was nearly too big for her to carry. The wild boy grabbed the hands of the twin girls. The silent girl followed last, her eyes still fixed on some distant point no one else could see. They climbed into the wagon bed. 7 children packed together like refugees, which Silas supposed was exactly what they were. He took his place at the front, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward. The crowd parted. Silas felt their eyes on his back, felt their judgment, felt their curiosity about what a man like him would do with 7 orphans. He felt Sterling's eyes most of all, cold, calculating, waiting. As they left Clearwater behind, the boy named Thomas spoke from the wagon bed. "Why did you buy us?" Silas didn't turn around. "I didn't buy you. You gave him $4,000. That's buying. I paid to get you away from him. There's a difference." Silence. Then, "What do you want from us?" The question hung in the cold air. Silas thought about it. What did he want? He'd asked himself that same question every morning for 3 years, every morning when he woke up in an empty house that still smelled like Sarah's lavender soap. Every morning when he walked past his daughter Rose's room and saw her doll sitting on the bed exactly where she'd left it. What did he want? "I want you to not die," he said finally. "That's all." More silence. The wagon wheels creaked. The horse's breath steamed in the cold air. The children huddled together against the wind. 20 miles separated Clearwater from McKenna Ranch. 20 miles of frozen prairie and scattered pine. The sun was setting by the time Silas turned the wagon up the long drive that led to his property. The house appeared through the twilight. 2 stories, log construction, windows dark and empty. It had been beautiful once, when Sarah was alive, when Rose's laughter filled the rooms, when there was a reason to keep the lamps lit and the fires burning. Now it looked like what it was, a tomb for the living. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the barn. He climbed down his joints, protesting the cold and the long ride. The children sat in the wagon bed watching him, waiting. "Inside," he said, gesturing to the house. "There's beds upstairs. 3 rooms. Figure out who sleeps where." Thomas climbed down first. He helped the others, his movements careful, protective. When the sick boy started coughing again, Thomas picked him up and carried him. The 9-year-old girl took the hands of the twin girls. The wild boy and the silent girl followed. They stood in a cluster at the base of the porch steps, looking up at the dark house like it might swallow them whole. "You're not coming in?" Thomas asked. Silas shook his head. "I sleep in the barn, have for 3 years. House has too many ghosts." "Then why are you making us sleep there?" "Because you're alive. The dead can't hurt you. The living are the ones you need to watch out for." He turned toward the barn. Behind him he heard the soft shuffle of feet on wood as the children climbed the porch steps. He heard the creak of the door opening. He heard Thomas's voice, low and cautious, telling the others to stay together. Silas entered the barn. His mare nickered softly from her stall. He unsaddled her, gave her grain and water, then climbed the ladder to the loft where he'd been sleeping since Sarah died. There was a blanket up there, a pillow that had lost most of its stuffing. A small window that looked out toward the house. Through that window he could see lamplight beginning to glow in the upstairs rooms. Shadows moved behind the curtains, small shadows, child-shaped shadows. For the first time in 3 years his house looked alive. Silas lay down on his blanket. He stared up at the barn rafters, tried to sleep, couldn't. What had he done? What was he thinking? 7 children, 7 mouths to feed, 7 lives depending on him. Not to fail again. He had failed Sarah, failed to save her when the diphtheria took her breath away piece by piece, failed Rose, his baby girl who'd died 2 days after her mother, failed to do anything except dig 2 holes in the frozen ground and lower 2 pine boxes and stand there in the rain, wondering why God would take everything from a man and leave him breathing. And now he'd just taken on 7 more chances to fail. But as he lay there in the dark, he thought about Thomas's eyes. That look of pure hatred directed at Sterling, that willingness to speak truth even when truth could get you killed. He thought about the sick boy's cough, the way the 9-year-old girl had carried him even though he was nearly her size, the way the twin girls held hands like letting go meant death. He thought about the silent girl who saw everything and said nothing. He thought about what Sarah would say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh. That laugh she had that sounded like music. She'd probably say something like, "Took you long enough to find a reason to come back to the living?" And maybe she'd be right. Silas closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd figure out how to feed 7 children. Tomorrow he'd figure out how to keep them warm and safe and away from men like Sterling. Tomorrow. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he didn't lie awake wishing he'd been the one to die instead. Tonight, he lay awake, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. In the house through the window, the lights burned on into the night. 7 children who'd been nobodies, who'd been bought and sold like cattle, who'd survived things that would break. Most adults lay awake in beds that were softer than anything they'd felt in years. And they wondered about the man who'd paid $4,000 for them, and then told them he didn't want anything. They wondered what the catch was. They wondered when the other shoe would drop. They wondered, but they didn't hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope got you hurt. So they stayed awake, and they watched the shadows, and they waited for whatever came next. Because that's what you did when you'd learned that the world was cruel and adults were liars and safety was just another word for the moment before everything fell apart. But in the barn, Silas McKenna slept, and in his dreams, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah smiled. Dawn came cold and gray over McKenna Ranch. Silas woke to the sound of silence, which was wrong. A ranch was never silent. There should have been chickens clucking, horses nickering for their morning grain, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. But there was nothing. He climbed down from the loft and stepped out into the pale morning light. Frost covered everything like a shroud. His breath steamed in the air. 20 yards away the house sat dark and quiet. Too quiet. Silas crossed the distance between barn and house with his heart climbing into his throat. Had they run during the night? Had they decided a man who slept in a barn couldn't be trusted? Had they frozen to death in beds they didn't know how to warm? He pushed open the front door. 7 pairs of eyes stared back at him from the living room. They'd gathered together on the floor in front of the cold fireplace, blankets wrapped around their thin bodies. The twin girls sat in the center, surrounded by the others like a fortress of children. The sick boy lay with his head in the 9-year-old girl's lap. The wild boy crouched near the door, ready to run. The silent girl sat perfectly still in the corner, watching. And Thomas, the oldest, stood between Silas and the rest of them, a kitchen knife in his hand. "Put that down," Silas said quietly. "Why should I?" "Because if I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have spent $4,000 buying you first." Thomas's jaw clenched. The knife didn't lower. "Men lie." "Yes, they do." Silas stepped further into the room. Thomas tensed, but didn't move. "Your name's Thomas Reed. That what you said yesterday?" So I'm Silas McKenna. This is my house. Those are my blankets you're using. That's my knife you're holding. And right now I'm going to make breakfast. You can stand there with that knife all morning if you want. Won't change the fact that you're hungry, and I'm the only one here who knows how to cook." He walked past Thomas toward the kitchen, felt the boy's eyes drilling into his back, felt the weight of 7 lives he didn't ask for and couldn't refuse. The kitchen was exactly as Sarah had left it 3 years ago, pots hanging on hooks, dishes stacked neatly in the cupboard, her apron still hanging on the peg by the stove. Silas had avoided this room for 3 years, eaten cold food rather than face the ghost of his wife standing at the stove, humming while she cooked. But 7 children needed to eat, so he lit the stove. He found eggs in the cold box, though they were old, and he wasn't sure they were good. He found flour and lard and salt. His hands remembered the motions of making biscuits even though his heart didn't want to remember. Sarah had taught him to cook when they were first married. She'd laughed at his clumsy attempts, guided his hands with hers, kissed him when he burned the first 3 batches of bread. He could almost feel her hands on his now. The children appeared in the doorway one by one. First the 9-year-old girl, the sick boy leaning heavily against her. Then the wild boy, his eyes darting around the kitchen like he was cataloging exits. Then the twins still holding hands. Then the silent girl. Thomas came last. The knife was gone, but his eyes were just as sharp. "Sit," Silas said, nodding toward the table. They didn't move. "It's not poison, it's breakfast. You can eat or you can starve. Choice is yours." The sick boy started coughing, deep wet coughs that shook his small frame. The 9-year-old girl held him, whispering something Silas couldn't hear. When the coughing fit passed, the boy looked up at her with fever-bright eyes. "Lizzie, I'm hungry." The girl named Lizzie glanced at Thomas. Some silent communication passed between them. Thomas gave the smallest of nods. They sat. Silas put food in front of them, eggs, though they were more brown than yellow, biscuits, though they were hard enough to break teeth. It wasn't much, it wasn't good, but it was warm, and it was food, and the children fell on it like starving animals, which he supposed they were. The wild boy grabbed 3 biscuits at once and shoved them into his pockets. Silas saw but said nothing. The twins ate with their free hands, the other hands still clasped together. The sick boy Danny Lizzie had called him could barely swallow, but he tried. Silas watched them eat, watched the way they hunched over their plates protectively, watched the way their eyes kept flicking toward the door, watched the way they didn't trust any of this. When they finished, Lizzie raised her hand like she was in school. Her voice came out small and frightened. "Sir, tomorrow? Will there be food tomorrow?" The question hit Silas like a fist to the gut. Tomorrow. Such a simple word, such an impossible concept when you'd spent your life not knowing where your next meal would come from. He knelt down beside her chair. She flinched but didn't pull away. Up close he could see she was younger than he'd thought, maybe only 8. Too young to be carrying a sick boy, too young to be asking if she'd eat tomorrow. "Every day," he said, "3 meals, long as you want to stay here." Her eyes filled with tears. "You promise." Silas thought about promises, about the promise he'd made to Sarah to keep their daughter safe, about how he'd failed, about how promises were just words, and words meant nothing in the face of death and disease and a God who didn't listen. But this little girl needed to hear it. "I promise." Lizzie started crying. Not loud, violent sobs, but quiet tears that slid down her dirty cheeks and dripped onto the table. Then the twins started crying. Then Danny. Then even the wild boy's eyes got wet, though he turned away so no one would see. Only Thomas and the silent girl didn't cry. Thomas because he'd learned that tears were weakness. The silent girl because she'd forgotten how. Silas stood up uncomfortable with emotion, uncertain what to do with 7 crying children in his kitchen. So he did what Sarah would have done. He started cleaning up. The children helped without being asked. They carried dishes to the wash basin. They scraped plates. They moved around the kitchen like they'd been doing it together for years. This strange family of no one belonging to no one. When the kitchen was clean, Silas showed them the rest of the house. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, the room he'd shared with Sarah, which still had her clothes in the closet and her hairbrush on the dresser. Rose's room, which still had dolls on the shelves and a child's drawings pinned to the walls. And the spare room, which had nothing but dust and cobwebs. "You can split up however you want," Silas said, "or sleep in one room together if that's easier." Thomas looked at the others. "Together. For now." That night Silas gave them extra blankets and showed them how to bank the fire so it would last till morning. He showed them where the chamber pots were and where the outhouse stood in the yard. He answered their questions with as few words as possible, because words had never come easy to him and came even harder now. When he turned to leave, Thomas stopped him. "Why are you sleeping in the barn?" Silas paused at the top of the stairs. "This house has too many ghosts." "What kind of ghosts?" "The kind you can't bury." He left them then, walked back across the frozen yard to the barn, climbed to the loft, lay down on his blanket and stared at the ceiling. Through the small window, he could see the light in the upstairs bedroom. 7 shadows moved behind the curtains. He wondered what they were talking about, wondered if they were planning to run, wondered if they believed anything he'd said. Hours passed. The light in the house finally went out. Silas closed his eyes, and somewhere in the deep hours of the night, when the cold was at its worst and the stars burned like ice in the sky, a sound woke him. Coughing. Not the normal coughing of a winter cold, but the deep rattling cough of lungs that were filling with something that shouldn't be there. Silas was out of the loft and across the yard before his mind fully woke. He burst through the front door and took the stairs 3 at a time. In the bedroom, lit by a single candle, Danny lay on the floor convulsing with coughs. Blood flecked his lips. His skin had gone gray. Lizzie held him, crying. The others had pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes huge with fear. Thomas stood in the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists. "He's dying." Silas knelt beside the boy, felt his forehead. It was like touching a stove. He'd seen this before, in the war, in the camps, men burning up from the inside. Most of them didn't make it. "How long's he been sick?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. The people at the orphanage said he was faking. Silas looked at Thomas. "He's not faking. He's got pneumonia, maybe worse." "Can you fix him?" Such a simple question, such an impossible answer. Could he fix a dying boy? Could anyone? He hadn't been able to fix Rose when the diphtheria closed her throat. Hadn't been able to do anything but hold her while she suffocated. "I don't know." Thomas's face went hard. "Then he'll die, and when he dies you'll get rid of us. That's how it works. One problem leads to another, until we're all problems you don't want anymore." "That's not—" "Don't lie," Thomas's voice cracked. "We've all been through this before. They take you in. They feed you. They act nice. Then something goes wrong and suddenly you're back on the street or in the orphanage or sold to someone worse. So just tell us now, if Danny dies, do we all have to leave?" Silas looked around the room, at Lizzie cradling Danny's burning body, at the twins pressed together in the corner, at the wild boy ready to bolt, at the silent girl watching everything with those ancient eyes, at Thomas, 13 years old, trying to protect 6 other children when he was barely more than a child himself. "No one's leaving," Silas said. "Danny's not going to die. I'm not going to let him. You can't stop death. Watch me." He scooped Danny into his arms. The boy weighed nothing, all bones and fever. Silas carried him downstairs to the kitchen, Thomas right behind him. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 3 years ago when my daughter got sick. I'm fighting." He laid Danny on the kitchen table, grabbed blankets, started giving orders. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before running to help. The other children appeared at the kitchen door watching. Silas sent Thomas to pump water, sent Lizzie for more blankets. He stripped off Danny's sweat-soaked shirt and wrapped him in cool, wet cloths. He'd seen this done in the war, seen doctors fighting fevers this way. didn't always work. But sometimes it did. Danny thrashed and moaned. His eyes rolled back in his head. His breathing came in shallow gasps. Silas held him down gently. "Stay with us, boy. Don't you quit." Hours crawled past. Silas changed the wet cloths again and again, tried to get water down Danny's throat, listened to those terrible rattling breaths, and wondered if each one would be the last. Thomas sat on the floor against the wall, his eyes locked on Danny. The others had fallen asleep in various corners of the kitchen, exhausted by fear. "He's my cousin," Thomas said suddenly. "His ma died giving birth to him. His PA died in a factory fire. We ended up in the same orphanage 2 years ago. I promised his ma before she died that I'd look after him." Silas didn't look up from Danny's pale face. "You've done good. He's dying." "Not yet, he's not. Why do you care? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Silas thought about that, about why he cared, about why he'd stopped in Clearwater, about why he'd paid $4,000 for 7 children he didn't know. "I had a daughter," he said finally. "Her name was Rose. She was 5 when she died. I held her just like this while she burned up with fever. I couldn't save her. Couldn't do anything but watch her die." He looked up at Thomas then. "Maybe I can't save Danny either, but I'm damn well going to try, because if I don't try, then Rose died for nothing. Then the last 3 years of living like a ghost meant nothing. You understand?" Thomas stared at him. Something shifted in those hard, suspicious eyes. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. "I understand." Dawn came again. Gray light filtering through the kitchen windows. Danny's fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse. His breathing was still labored, but steady. He was fighting, hanging on. Silas's arms ached from holding him. His back screamed from hunching over the table all night. But he didn't let go. The sound of a wagon pulling into the yard made him look up. Through the window, he saw a woman climbing down from the driver's seat. She wore a traveling dress and carried a medical bag. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was tired but kind. Thomas jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively going to his waistband, where the knife would have been if Silas hadn't taken it. "Who's that?" "I don't know." The woman knocked on the door. Silas didn't move from Danny's side. "It's open." She entered, taking in the scene with quick, professional eyes. 7 children, a sick boy on the table, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mr. McKenna, that's me. My name is Clara Whitfield. I'm sorry I'm late. Very late. There was some confusion with the telegraph. I'm the woman you sent for, from Boston." Silas stared at her. Sent for Boston. And then he remembered. 6 months ago, in a moment of loneliness so profound it had driven him to do something desperate, he'd answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. He'd exchanged letters with a widow from Boston, a woman who'd agreed to come west to be his wife. And then he'd gotten word that she wasn't coming, that the arrangement was off. Except here she was. "You're 2 months late," he said. "I know, I'm sorry. The telegraph operator made a mistake. I sent word that I'd be delayed, not that I wouldn't come. I understand if you've changed your mind, but I've traveled 2,000 miles, and I'd appreciate at least a cup of coffee before you send me back." She set down her bag and looked at Danny. "May I?" Silas nodded. Clara crossed to the table. Her hands moved over Danny's small body with practiced confidence. She felt his forehead, listened to his breathing, checked his pulse. "Pneumonia. Advanced. How long?" 3 weeks, maybe more." "And you've been treating him all night?" "Yes." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "Mr. McKenna, this boy needs constant care, cool compresses, fluid monitoring. The fever could break or it could kill him. It's going to take days." "Then it takes days." Something in her expression softened. "I'm a nurse. I trained at Massachusetts General before the war. I can help. If you'll let me." Silas looked at this stranger who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, this woman who'd walked into a house full of sick children and chaos and hadn't run screaming. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Then I'm staying." She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. And for the next 3 days, Silas McKenna and Clara Whitfield fought for Danny Ward's life. They took turns holding him, changing his compresses, forcing water down his throat. Thomas helped. Lizzie helped. Even the wild boy and the silent girl helped in their own ways. The house that had been dead for 3 years came alive with purpose. And on the dawn of the 4th day, just as hope was fading, Danny's fever broke. He opened his eyes and whispered, "I'm hungry." Clara checked his pulse one more time, then looked at Silas with tears streaming down her face. "He's going to live." Danny Ward ate 3 biscuits that morning, 4 days after arriving at McKenna Ranch, and 3 days after nearly dying. He drank a full cup of milk and fell asleep with a smile on his fever-broken face. Clara checked his pulse one more time, nodded with satisfaction, and finally allowed herself to sit down at the kitchen table. She'd been awake for 72 hours straight. Silas poured her coffee. Their hands touched briefly as he passed the cup. Neither of them pulled away quickly. Neither of them acknowledged it. "He'll live," Clara said. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "The fever broke clean. Give him a week of rest and proper food. He'll be stronger than he was before." Thomas stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face caught between relief and suspicion. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "And you're staying? You're really staying?" Clara looked at Silas, a question in her eyes. He'd avoided this conversation for 3 days, too focused on keeping Danny alive to think about what it meant that his mail-order bride had finally arrived. "That depends," Silas said carefully, "on what you want." "What I want?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mr. McKenna, I sold everything I owned to buy that train ticket. I left behind a city I'd lived in my whole life. I came here to marry a man I'd never met because my husband died 2 years ago and left me with nothing but debt. What I want doesn't really factor into survival." She set down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking. "But I need to know what I'm walking into. You wrote to me about a ranch and a quiet life. You didn't mention 7 children. I didn't have 7 children when I wrote those letters. And now you do." "Now I do." Clara looked around the kitchen, at the children who'd crept closer to listen, at the house that had clearly been abandoned for years and was just now remembering how to be lived in, at Silas, this weathered man who'd spent 3 days fighting for a boy he barely knew. "I'm a widow," she said. "My husband was a doctor. He taught me nursing because he said the frontier needed practical women. He died in a carriage accident before we could move west ourselves. So I answered your advertisement because I didn't have anywhere else to go." She met Silas's eyes. "I didn't come here expecting love or romance. I came here expecting partnership, a trade. I take care of your house, and you give me a place to belong." "But 7 children changes the equation." "How?" 7 children need a mother, not just a housekeeper. Can you offer that?" Silas thought about Sarah. About how she'd always wanted more children, but the pregnancies never took after Rose. About how she'd talked about adopting, about taking in orphans, about filling their house with life. About how she'd probably be laughing right now at the irony of him ending up with 7 children anyway. "I can offer whatever you're willing to give," he said. "These kids need someone who knows what they're doing. I'm just making it up as I go." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to where Thomas stood in the doorway, and knelt down to his level. "What's your name?" "Thomas Reed." "Thomas, I need you to be honest with me. Do you want me here?" The boy's jaw tightened. "Don't matter what I want. It matters to me." Thomas looked past her at Silas. Some wordless communication passed between them. Then Thomas looked back at Clara. "Danny almost died. If you hadn't been here, he would have died. So yeah, I want you here. We all do." Behind him, the other children nodded. Even the silent girl, the one who hadn't spoken since they'd arrived, gave the smallest dip of her head. Clara smiled. "Then I'm staying." She stood up and turned back to Silas. "But we need to discuss terms. Terms. Mr. McKenna, you and I were supposed to get married. That was the arrangement, but circumstances have changed. I won't marry a man I don't know, and I won't share a bed with a stranger. So I propose we table the marriage for now. I'll stay on as housekeeper and nurse. You pay me a wage. We get to know each other. And if, after a reasonable amount of time, we decide we suit, then we can revisit the original arrangement." Silas felt relief wash over him. He'd been dreading the marriage obligation, the expectation that he'd somehow honor the promises he'd made in letters when his heart was still buried in a grave marked Sarah. "That seems fair." "Good." Clara picked up her coffee cup again. "Now, tell me about the rest of them." Over the next hour, Silas told her what little he knew. Thomas and Danny were cousins. The girl named Lizzie Hayes had been caring for Danny since the orphanage. The wild boy was Samuel Cole, called Sam, and he'd been sold by his own father for drinking money. The twin girls were Ruby and Lily Murphy, their parents dead in a house fire. And the silent girl was Margaret O'Brien. Maggie, 8 years old. Hadn't spoken in 2 years since the night she'd found her mother hanging from a rope in their tenement apartment. Clara listened to all of it with a face that gave nothing away. When Silas finished, she set down her cup with deliberate care. "Mr. McKenna, do you have any idea what you've taken on? No? These children are traumatized, broken in ways that won't heal quickly or easily. Some of them may never heal completely. They'll test you. They'll push every boundary. They'll assume you're going to abandon them because that's what every adult in their lives has done. I know. Do you? Because I've seen men with good intentions give up orphans after a week, after a day sometimes. When the reality sets in that children aren't grateful little servants, they're complicated, damaged human beings who require patience and love and commitment." Silas met her eyes. "I buried my wife and daughter 3 years ago, spent those years wishing I'd died with them. Yesterday I spent 72 hours fighting for a boy I don't know, because if I let him die, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of surviving if I'm not going to actually live?" He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "So yeah, I know what I've taken on, and I'm not giving up on them, not now, not ever." Clara stared at him. Then slowly she smiled. "Good, because neither am I." They shook hands on it. A partnership, not marriage, not yet, maybe not ever. But two people agreeing to fight for 7 children who needed someone to fight for them. That afternoon, Clara moved into the spare bedroom. She unpacked her trunk with brisk efficiency while the children watched from the doorway. She had practical clothes, a few books, and a framed photograph of a man Silas assumed was her dead husband. She set the photograph on the dresser without comment. By evening, she'd started organizing the house. She put Thomas and Sam and Danny in Rose's old room, put Lizzie and the twins and Maggie in the spare room with her, made lists of supplies they'd need, started planning meals for the week. She moved through the house like someone reclaiming territory that had been lost to wilderness. Silas watched her from the doorway, watched the way the children gravitated toward her, watched the way she corrected them gently when they reached for food without asking. Watched the way she knelt down to their level instead of towering over them. She'd be a good mother, if that's what this became, if they lasted that long. The week passed in a blur of routine. Clara cooked breakfast while Silas tended the animals. Thomas started helping with the ranch work, learning to mend fences and shoe horses. Sam slowly stopped hoarding food in his pockets. Lizzie taught the twins their letters. Danny grew stronger every day. Only Maggie remained unchanged, silent, watching, present, but not really there. On the 8th day after Clara's arrival, Silas found a paper nailed to his gate. It was an official document, stamped and sealed, the words blurred together at first, his reading still rough from years of neglect. But the meaning became clear after the 3rd pass. According to Wyoming orphan law of 1872, all purchased orphans must be verified by the court within 30 days. If living conditions are deemed unsuitable, children will be removed and placed in more appropriate homes. Inspector will arrive December 15, 1874, to conduct evaluation. Signed, Judge Cornelius Sterling. Silas read it 3 times. Then he crumpled it in his fist and walked back to the house. Clara was kneading bread dough in the kitchen. She took one look at his face and wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He handed her the paper, watched her face go pale as she read. "This is illegal," she said. "He can't just take children from a suitable home. He can if he's the judge, and he can declare any home unsuitable if he wants. Says right there in the law." "When?" "December 15th, 3 weeks." Clara set the paper down carefully. Her hands were shaking again, but her voice stayed steady. "What's this really about? Money? Control? Sterling makes his living selling orphans to people who need cheap labor. I took 7 of them off his market, cost him thousands in future profits. So this is revenge. This is business. Revenge is just a bonus." They stood in silence for a moment. Outside they could hear the children playing in the yard. Thomas was teaching Sam how to throw a rope. Lizzie was singing to the twins, normal sounds, family sounds. "If he takes them," Clara said quietly, "where will they go? Separate homes, different families. He'll split them up. That'll destroy them. They barely trust us. If they're separated, they'll never trust anyone again." Silas knew she was right. He'd seen it in Thomas's eyes. The way the boy looked at his younger cousins and siblings, this makeshift family he'd cobbled together from orphanage scraps. Lose them, and Thomas would become something hard and unreachable. They all would. "We have 3 weeks," Silas said. We make this place pass inspection. Make it clear the children are well cared for. It won't be enough. Sterling will find something wrong. He'll invent problems if he has to. Clara picked up the paper again, studied it. Unless we remove his objection. What objection? You're unmarried, a single man raising 7 children, that's what he'll use against you. But a married couple, with a woman who's trained as a nurse, that's much harder to argue against. Silas understood what she was suggesting. You said you wouldn't marry a stranger. I did say that, but circumstances change, don't they? Clara folded the paper with precise movements. Mr. McKenna, I don't love you, you don't love me, but I care about those children out there. And if marrying you protects them, then that's what we'll do. That's not fair to you. Fair? She laughed. Mr. McKenna, I'm a widow with no money and no prospects living on a ranch in the middle of nowhere with 7 traumatized children. Fair doesn't factor into my life anymore. Survival does. She met his eyes. This can be a business arrangement, a partnership in writing. We present a united front to Sterling and his inspector. We prove that these children are in a proper home with proper guardians. And when it's all over, if you want to annul the marriage, we can discuss it. Silas thought about Sarah, about the promises he'd made to love and honor until death, about how guilty he'd felt just thinking about another woman. But Sarah was dead, and 7 children were alive. All right, he said, we'll do it. Thomas had been listening from the hallway. They both knew it. The boy was always listening, always watching, always waiting for the moment adults would reveal their true intentions. He stepped into the kitchen now, his face carefully blank. So you're getting married to save us? We're getting married because it's practical, Clara said, and because it will help. But you don't love each other? No, not yet. Maybe not ever. But we respect each other, and sometimes that's enough. Thomas looked between them. Silas saw him trying to understand, trying to figure out if this was real or just another adult lie. My ma and P.A. loved each other, Thomas said quietly. Didn't stop them from dying. Didn't stop me from ending up in an orphanage. He crossed his arms. Maybe respect is better. Love makes you hope for things, and hope just hurts when it doesn't work out. Clara walked over to him. She didn't kneel down this time. She stood at his level, one adult to another. Thomas, I won't lie to you. I don't know if this will work. I don't know if we can stop Sterling, but I promise you this. I will fight for you and your family with everything I have. Not because I'm being paid, not because it's my duty, but because you deserve someone who fights for you. Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked away, blinking hard. When's the wedding? Tomorrow, Silas said. Reverend Crane can come out from town. That fast. No reason to wait. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he left the kitchen without another word. Through the window, Silas watched him walk out to the barn. The boy stood there for a long time, his shoulders shaking in a way that suggested tears he'd never let anyone see. That night, Silas lay in the barn loft and thought about the last time he'd gotten married. 20 years ago, Sarah in a white dress she'd sewn herself. His hands shaking as he put the ring on her finger, the way she'd smiled at him like he'd hung the moon. Tomorrow would be nothing like that. Tomorrow would be 2 strangers signing papers to protect 7 children from a corrupt judge. But as he lay there in the dark, he thought about the past week, about Clara's hands, steady and sure as she'd fought for Danny's life, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd promised not to give up on the children, about how she'd walked into chaos and made it feel like home. Maybe Silas couldn't love her the way he'd loved Sarah, but maybe he could build something different, something that would last. In the house, Clara sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. She looked at the crumpled paper from Sterling, looked at her wedding ring from her first marriage, which she still wore on a chain around her neck. I'm sorry, James, she whispered to her dead husband, but they need me, and I need them. She took off the chain, put the ring in a drawer, closed it with finality. Tomorrow, she'd marry a stranger. Tomorrow, she'd become a mother to 7 children who weren't hers. Tomorrow, she'd start a war with a man who had the law on his side. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Clara Whitfield felt like she had a purpose, and that was worth more than love. That was worth everything. Reverend Isaiah Crane arrived at McKenna Ranch at noon the next day, his worn Bible tucked under his arm and questions in his eyes. He'd known Silas for 15 years, had buried Sarah and Rose, had watched a good man turn into a ghost. Now that ghost was getting married. You're sure about this, Silas? The Reverend stood in the parlor, his voice low enough that the children gathering in the doorway couldn't hear. "It's been 3 years since Sarah, and this woman, you barely know her." "I know enough." "Do you?" "Because marriage isn't something you do out of convenience. It's a sacred bond before God and man." Silas looked through the doorway at the 7 children crowded there. Thomas stood at the front, his arms crossed protectively. Behind him, the others watched with expressions ranging from hope to fear to nothing at all. "Sarah wanted children," Silas said quietly. "After Rose, she couldn't have any more. She used to talk about adopting, about filling this house with kids who needed a home. She'd have done it herself if she'd lived." He turned back to the Reverend. "So maybe this isn't the marriage I planned, but it's the one she would have wanted." Reverend Crane studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Where's the bride?" Clara came down the stairs wearing her traveling dress, the nicest thing she owned. Her hair was pinned up, her hands were steady. She looked like a woman going to a business meeting, not a wedding, which Silas supposed was exactly what this was. They stood before the Reverend with 7 children as their only witnesses. No flowers, no music, no guests, just 2 people making promises they hoped they could keep. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Crane began, then stopped. He closed his Bible. "Actually, let's skip the sermon. I think we all know why we're here." He looked at Clara. "Clara Whitfield, do you take this man as your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "Silas McKenna, do you take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Silas glanced at the photograph of Sarah still sitting on the mantel. Her smile frozen forever in silver and glass. For 3 years he'd talked to that photograph, asked it questions, begged it for forgiveness. Now he needed her permission to move forward. The photograph, of course, said nothing, but in his mind he heard her voice, the way she'd sounded the night before she died when she'd gripped his hand and whispered through the pain. "Don't you dare stop living when I'm gone, Silas McKenna. You hear me? Don't you dare." "I do," he said. Reverend Crane cleared his throat. "Then, by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." He paused. "You may kiss the bride." Silence fell over the room. Clara and Silas looked at each other. 2 strangers bound by paper and necessity. Silas leaned forward and pressed his lips to Clara's cheek. Brief, chaste. The kiss of business partners, not lovers. "There!" Sam's voice cut through the awkward moment. "Happy now?" Thomas elbowed him. "Shut up." But the tension broke. Clara smiled. Even Silas felt his mouth twitch towards something that wasn't quite grief. "Well," Reverend Crane said, putting his Bible away, "that's that. May God have mercy on your souls." He looked at the children. "All of you." They ate dinner together that evening. All 9 of them crowded around a table built for 4. Clara had made stew from the last of the winter vegetables. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and it was food, and it was theirs. Halfway through the meal, Sam set down his spoon. "We supposed to pray or something?" Everyone looked at him. "I don't know," Sam said defensively. "Married people pray, don't they? That's what they do at real families." Thomas opened his mouth probably to say something cutting about real families, but Clara spoke first. "We can pray if you'd like. Does anyone know how—" Silence. "I knew the Lord's Prayer once," Lizzie offered quietly, "but I forgot most of it." "I know one," Danny said. His voice was still weak but growing stronger every day. "The nuns taught us. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." The room went quiet. That prayer, Silas thought, said everything about these children's lives. A prayer that assumed death before morning. A prayer for children who'd learned not to count on waking up. "Let's try something different," Clara said gently. "A prayer doesn't have to be fancy words someone else wrote. It can just be saying thank you." "For what?" Sam asked. "For whatever you're grateful for." More silence. Then Thomas spoke, his voice rough. "Thank you for not leaving us." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Such a simple thing, not leaving. The bare minimum of human decency, and it was the biggest thing these children could imagine being grateful for. Silas had to look away, had to stare at his plate until the burning in his eyes subsided. Clara's hand found his under the table, squeezed once, then let go. "Amen," she said softly. "Amen," the children echoed. They ate in silence after that. But it was a different kind of silence, not uncomfortable. Just 7 children and 2 adults learning how to be something they'd never been before, a family. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Clara scrubbed the house from top to bottom. Silas repaired the porch steps, fixed the broken shutters, replaced the cracked window in the parlor. Together they transformed the house from a mausoleum to a home. The children helped. Thomas learned to mend fences and care for livestock. Sam, with his quick hands and quicker temper, turned out to be surprisingly good at carpentry. Lizzie organized the kitchen, with Clara learning to cook and preserve food. Danny, still recovering, helped where he could, mostly by keeping the twins entertained. Even Maggie helped in her own silent way. She drew pictures and pinned them to the walls, images of the ranch, the horses, the other children, her way of saying things she couldn't speak. Silas watched them transform before his eyes. Thomas stood a little taller. Sam smiled occasionally, though he tried to hide it. Lizzie laughed. The twins started to let go of each other's hands for brief moments. They were healing. But healing was slow and fragile and could break at any moment. On December 10th, 5 days before the inspection, Judge Sterling came to visit. Silas saw him riding up the long drive, flanked by 2 deputies. He felt his jaw tighten, felt his hands curl into fists. Beside him, Clara touched his arm lightly. "Stay calm," she murmured. "Don't give him ammunition." The children had scattered at the sight of Sterling, all except Thomas, who stood on the porch beside Silas like a soldier preparing for battle. Sterling dismounted with the self-satisfaction of a man who held all the cards. His eyes swept over the ranch, cataloging improvements with obvious displeasure. "McKenna, Mrs. McKenna." He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Heard you got married. Congratulations. Very convenient timing." "What do you want, Sterling?" "Just checking on my investment. Those children represent a significant amount of money. Want to make sure they're being properly cared for." "Your investment, you sold them to me." "Temporarily, until the court determines permanent placement." Sterling's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "That's what the law says, and I am the law in this county." He pushed past Silas into the house without invitation. The deputies followed. Silas and Clara had no choice but to let them in. Sterling walked through the house with the eyes of a man looking for faults. He checked the bedrooms, opened cupboards, ran his finger along surfaces looking for dust. The children pressed themselves against walls, their earlier confidence evaporating in the presence of their tormentor. "Where do you sleep, McKenna?" Sterling asked, standing in the doorway of Clara's room. "The barn." Sterling's eyebrows rose. "The barn? You married this woman, and you sleep in the barn?" "The children need the bedrooms." "Interesting. So you're not actually living as man and wife?" Clara stepped forward. "Judge Sterling, our sleeping arrangements are none of your concern. On the contrary, Mrs. McKenna, if this marriage is merely a legal fiction designed to circumvent orphan placement laws, that's very much my concern." He turned back to Silas. "A marriage that isn't consummated isn't really a marriage, is it?" Heat flooded Silas's face, not from embarrassment but from rage. He took a step forward. Thomas grabbed his arm. "Don't," the boy whispered. "That's what he wants." Thomas was right. Sterling wanted Silas to lose his temper, wanted an excuse to claim the children were in an unstable home with a violent guardian. Silas forced himself to breathe, to unclench his fists. "You've seen the house," he said through gritted teeth. "The children are clean-fed and healthy. You have no grounds to remove them. I'll be the judge of that, literally." Sterling adjusted his coat. "The inspector will arrive on the 15th as scheduled. He'll interview the children separately, without you present, and then we'll see what they have to say about their treatment here." He walked to the door, then paused. "Oh, and McKenna, I've already contacted 4 families interested in taking these children. Good Christian homes. People who actually want them, not just bought them on a whim. They're not for sale." "Everything's for sale. You should know that by now." Sterling left. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Silas stood in the middle of his house, shaking with fury and helplessness. "He's going to take them," Thomas said. His voice was flat. "Dead. He's going to split us up." "No." Clara's voice was steel. "He's not. How are you going to stop him? He's a judge. He can do whatever he wants." "Not if we prove he's corrupt." Silas turned to her. "How?" "We find evidence. We find other families he sold children to. We document the bribes and kickbacks. We expose him. In 5 days, that's impossible. Maybe, but we have to try." That night, after the children were in bed, Silas and Clara sat at the kitchen table making plans. They sent word to Reverend Crane to start asking questions in town, to Doc Hartley to check medical records of orphans placed in Sterling's care. They were building a case, fighting back the only way they knew how. But it felt like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. 3 days before the inspection, something shifted. Reverend Crane arrived with news. He'd found 2 families willing to testify, families who'd taken in orphans from Sterling's auctions and witnessed the corruption firsthand. Doc Hartley brought medical records showing children placed in dangerous work conditions, suffering injuries Sterling had ignored. A deputy named Marcus Webb came forward. He'd been keeping his own records of Sterling's dealings, dates, amounts, names of people who'd paid bribes. "Why now?" Silas asked him. "Why come forward now?" Webb looked uncomfortable. "Because I've got kids of my own, and watching you fight for those 7 made me realize I was on the wrong side." He set a leather journal on the table. "Everything's in here. 3 years of evidence." By December the 14th, they had enough to bury Sterling, enough to expose him for what he was. But they needed the inspector to listen, needed him to care more about justice than politics. That night, Silas couldn't sleep. He stood in the yard staring at the house. Light glowed in the upstairs windows. He could see shadows moving. Clara helping Lizzie brush her hair. Thomas reading to Danny. Sam teaching the twins some hand game. A family. His family. Tomorrow a stranger would come and judge whether they deserved to stay together. Tomorrow Sterling would try to tear them apart. Tomorrow everything Silas had built over the past month could come crashing down. "You're brooding." He turned to find Clara standing behind him, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. "Thinking," he corrected, "amounts to the same thing." She came to stand beside him. "You're wondering if we've done enough. Have we? I don't know, but I know we've done everything we could." She looked up at the stars. "My husband used to say that healing isn't about doing everything right. It's about not giving up when things go wrong." "You loved him, your first husband." "I did. Very much." "Do you think you could ever feel that way about me?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, Silas. Right now I respect you. I admire you. I'm grateful to you for giving me a purpose again. Is that enough?" "Maybe, maybe not. But it's what I have to give. That's honest. We promised each other honesty. Remember?" They stood together in the darkness. 2 people who'd agreed to build something practical and discovered it might be becoming something real. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Clara said, "I want you to know I'm glad I came here. I'm glad I met you. I'm glad we're fighting this fight together. Even if we lose, even if we lose." Inside the house, a child laughed. The sound drifted through the window like music, like hope. "We're not going to lose," Silas said. "I won't let Sterling destroy them. Then we'd better get some sleep." Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But neither of them moved. They stayed there in the yard, shoulder to shoulder, drawing strength from each other. And in the morning, when the inspector's wagon appeared on the horizon, they were ready, ready to fight for 7 children who'd become theirs, ready to face whatever came next, together. The inspector arrived at dawn. His name was Horace Grimby, and he looked exactly like a man who'd spent his life measuring other people's failures. Thin, gray, eyes that saw problems where others saw solutions. He climbed down from his rented carriage with a leather satchel full of forms and regulations. Behind him, Judge Sterling sat in his own wagon, watching with the satisfied expression of a cat who'd cornered a mouse. Silas stood on the porch with Clara beside him. The children were inside, lined up in the parlor like soldiers awaiting inspection. They'd practiced this, rehearsed answers, prepared for every question. But preparation couldn't stop the fear. "Mr. and Mrs. McKenna," Grimby's voice was colorless, professional. "I'm here to conduct a welfare evaluation of the 7 minor children currently in your care. This will include a physical inspection of the premises, individual interviews with each child, and review of your financial capacity to provide adequate support." "We understand," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. Silas loved her for that. Grimby spent the next 2 hours examining every inch of the house. He checked food stores, measured bedroom dimensions, counted blankets and dishes and pairs of shoes. He made notes in a small book with mechanical precision. Sterling followed like a shadow, occasionally pointing out imagined deficiencies. "That window has a draft. Those stairs are steep for small children. Is that mold on the ceiling?" Silas's hands clenched into fists a dozen times. Each time Clara's hand found his, squeezed. reminded him to breathe. When the physical inspection concluded, Grimby turned to the children gathered nervously in the parlor. "I need to interview each of you separately," he announced, "starting with the oldest." "No." Thomas stepped forward. "We stay together." "Young man, the protocol requires individual interviews to ensure honesty." "You want honesty? Then let us all hear the questions. Let us all give our answers. We've got nothing to hide." Grimby looked to Sterling, who shrugged. "Let them have their way. Won't change the outcome." So they stayed together. 7 children huddled on the sofa and floor while Grimby fired questions like bullets. How long had they been here? Were they being forced to work? Did they have enough to eat? Were they being disciplined physically? Did they feel safe? The children answered in turn. Thomas spoke with careful control. Lizzie's voice shook but held steady. Sam was defensive, suspicious. The twins whispered their answers in unison. Danny smiled and talked about how Mrs. McKenna had saved his life. Only Maggie remained silent. When Grimby asked her questions directly, she simply stared at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "The O'Brien girl," Grimby consulted his notes. "According to records, she hasn't spoken in 2 years." "That's correct," Clara said, "but she communicates in other ways." "How can I evaluate her welfare if she won't speak?" Maggie stood up. Walked to where Silas stood against the wall. She took his hand. Then she walked to Clara and took her hand. She stood between them, linking them together through her small body. The message was clear. "This is my family. This is where I belong." Grimby made a note. His face revealed nothing. The interview continued. Question after question designed to find cracks in the foundation. And through it all, Sterling watched with barely concealed glee, waiting for the moment everything would collapse. "Mr. McKenna," Grimby said finally, "I understand you purchased these children for $4,000. That's a significant sum. What was your motivation? To save them. From what? From him." Silas pointed at Sterling. "From being sold to people who'd worked them to death. From being separated and scattered across the territory like livestock." Sterling's face reddened. "That's a serious accusation. It's the truth, and I can prove it." Silas nodded to Clara, who produced Deputy Webb's journal. She handed it to Grimby, who paged through it with increasing interest. His colorless face showed the first hint of emotion. Shock, then anger. "Judge Sterling," Grimby said slowly, "this journal contains detailed records of financial transactions between you and various business owners, transactions involving the placement of orphan children. Lies, all lies. That deputy is a drunk with a grudge. Then how do you explain these matching dates and amounts?" Grimby held up the journal. "Children placed in mines, mills, and factories. Children who suffered injuries. Children who died in your care." "I'm not on trial here. These people are." Sterling pointed at Silas and Clara. "They're the ones who need to be investigated." "Actually," a new voice cut through the argument, "you are on trial." Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall, distinguished, silver hair and a badge that caught the morning light. Behind him stood Reverend Crane Doc Hartley and at least 20 other townspeople. "Who the hell are you?" Sterling demanded. "U.S. Marshal James Blackwood. I've been investigating complaints about child welfare in this county for the past 3 months." He pulled out a folded document. "Judge Cornelius Sterling, you're under arrest for corruption, bribery, and trafficking in human beings." The world seemed to stop. Sterling's face went from red to white. "You can't arrest me. I'm a judge. You were a judge. Now you're just a criminal." 2 deputies moved forward, not Sterling's men, but federal deputies. They put Sterling in irons while he sputtered protests and threats. "You'll stand trial in Cheyenne within the month," the marshal said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Federal charges, trafficking in human beings, that carries 20 years minimum." Sterling's face went from white to gray. "You can't prove anything." "We already have. Your own deputy's journal, bank records, witness testimony from a dozen families." The marshal nodded to his men. "Take him away." The children watched with wide eyes as the man who'd haunted their nightmares was led toward the door in chains. As Sterling passed the row where Silas and his family sat, Thomas stood up, blocking his path for just a moment. "You don't get to hurt children anymore," the boy said quietly. "You're done." Sterling opened his mouth to respond, but the deputy pulled him away. But even as Sterling was led outside, still shouting about lawyers and appeals, Silas felt no relief. Because Grimby still held his evaluation book, still had the power to take the children away. The marshal turned to him. Mr. McKenna, you have my thanks. Your complaint to the territorial governor started this investigation. Without your courage in coming forward, Sterling would still be destroying lives. I didn't file any complaint. No, but someone did, on your behalf. Clara stepped forward. I did, 3 weeks ago. I wrote to the governor's office detailing everything we'd learned about Sterling's operation. Silas stared at her. You never told me. Because I didn't know if it would work. Didn't want to give false hope. The marshal smiled. Well, it worked. Sterling will stand trial in Cheyenne, along with several others who participated in his schemes. He looked at the children. These 7 will need permanent placement. The territorial court will make a final determination. They have permanent placement, Silas said, right here. That's not my decision to make. The marshal turned to Grimby. But it is his. All eyes turned to the inspector. Grimby closed his evaluation book with careful precision. For a long moment he said nothing, just looked at the 7 children, at Silas and Clara, at the house that had been transformed from a tomb to a home. I've conducted 47 orphan evaluations in my career, Grimby said finally. Most homes are adequate, some are good. Very few are what children actually need. He paused. This home is what children need. Relief flooded through Silas so powerfully his knees almost buckled. However, Grimby continued, and the relief turned to ice. There remains the question of the marriage. Judge Sterling raised a valid point. A marriage that exists only on paper isn't a marriage at all, and the law requires children be placed in stable, genuine family units. Our marriage is genuine, Clara protested. Is it you've been married 3 weeks and your husband still sleeps in the barn? Silence fell like a hammer. The children looked at each other. Thomas's face went hard. Sam's eyes darted toward the door. Even the twins' grip on each other tightened. They thought this was the end, thought the adults were about to fail them again. Silas couldn't let that happen. You want to know why I sleep in the barn? His voice was rough. Because 3 years ago I watched my wife die in the bedroom upstairs, watched my 5-year-old daughter die 2 days later. I couldn't save them, couldn't do anything but dig 2 holes and bury them and wonder why God let me survive. He looked at the 7 children. For 3 years I lived like a ghost, went through motions, waited to die. Then I saw 7 kids being sold like cattle, and something in me woke up, something that said maybe I couldn't save Sarah and Rose, but I could save them. His voice broke. I sleep in the barn because that house is full of ghosts. But these children, they're filling it with life again. They're giving me a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to keep going. He turned to Clara. And this woman. I may not love her the way I loved my first wife, not yet, maybe not ever. But I respect her, I admire her. I trust her with the lives of these children, which means I trust her with everything that matters. Silas took Clara's hand. So yes, our marriage is real. It's not what either of us planned, but it's what we built together. And if that's not genuine, then I don't know what is. Tears streamed down Clara's face. She gripped his hand like a lifeline. Grimby watched this display with his colorless eyes. Then he made a final note in his book. The territorial court will receive my recommendation that all 7 children be permanently placed with Silas and Clara McKenna. Adoption papers will be processed immediately. The children erupted. Danny started crying. Lizzie hugged Sam, who didn't pull away. The twins finally let go of each other to throw their arms around Clara's legs. Thomas stood frozen, his face caught between disbelief and hope. Only Maggie remained still. She stared at Silas with those dark, seeing eyes, and then for the first time in 2 years, her lips moved. Thank you. The words were barely a whisper, rough with disuse, but they were words, real words, spoken out loud. The room went silent. Everyone stared at Maggie, the little girl who hadn't spoken since finding her mother dead, the child who'd locked her voice away where it couldn't hurt or be hurt. She'd spoken. Clara knelt down, tears streaming. Oh, sweetheart. Oh, Maggie. But Maggie wasn't looking at Clara. She was looking at Silas. You didn't leave us, she said, her voice gaining strength. Everyone else left. Everyone else gave up. But you stayed. You fought. She crossed to where Silas stood and wrapped her thin arms around his waist. You're my papa now, and I love you. Something broke inside Silas, some wall he'd built 3 years ago when he lowered his daughter into frozen ground. It shattered like glass, and everything he'd been holding back came flooding out. He dropped to his knees and pulled Maggie close. His shoulders shook with sobs he'd been suppressing for 3 years. Thomas came over and put a hand on his shoulder, then Danny, then all of them surrounding him in a circle of small bodies and fierce loyalty. Clara knelt beside them, her arms around as many children as she could reach. A family, broken people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to hold on. The townspeople who'd gathered to witness wiped their eyes. Even Grimby looked away, his professional mask cracking for just a moment. The marshal cleared his throat. "Well, I'd say that settles it." He left with his deputies, taking Sterling away to face justice. Grimby packed up his evaluation materials and departed with a promise to file his recommendation immediately. Reverend Crane blessed the house and family. Doc Hartley examined the children one final time and declared them the healthiest orphans he'd ever seen. Slowly, the house emptied, until only 9 people remained. Silas stood in his parlor, surrounded by 7 children who were now legally his. Clara beside him, her hand in his. Through the window, he could see the barn where he'd been sleeping. "I think," he said quietly, "it's time I moved back into the house." Clara smiled. "I think so, too." That night, Silas McKenna slept in his own bed for the first time in 3 years. Clara slept in the room next to his. The children slept in their rooms, finally secure in the knowledge that they had a home that wouldn't disappear in the morning. And in the darkness, Silas whispered to the ghost of his first wife, "I hope you understand, Sarah. I hope you know I'll always love you, but I can't keep living in the past. These children need me. Clara needs me, and I need them." He thought he heard her voice, soft as a breeze through open windows. "I know, my love, I know. Live. Please live." So he did. The trial of Judge Cornelius Sterling began on January 15, 1875, exactly 1 month after his arrest in Cheyenne. The territorial courthouse was packed. Ranchers and miners, shopkeepers and farmers, people who'd lost children to Sterling's corruption, people who'd stayed silent too long. Silas sat in the front row with Clara beside him, and 7 children pressed close. Thomas held Danny's hand. Lizzie kept the twins calm. Sam sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Maggie watched everything with those seeing eyes, occasionally whispering observations to Clara. The prosecuting attorney was a sharp woman named Elizabeth Hartford. She'd traveled from Denver specifically for this case. She laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Webb's journal, testimony from families who had been extorted, medical records of children who died in Sterling's care. Sterling's lawyer tried to fight back, claimed the journal was fabricated, claimed the witnesses were liars, claimed his client was being persecuted for doing difficult but necessary work. But the evidence was overwhelming. On the 3rd day of testimony, Attorney Hartford called Thomas Reed to the stand. Silas felt the boy stiffen beside him. They'd discussed this. Thomas didn't have to testify if he didn't want to. No one would force him to relive his trauma in front of a room full of strangers. But Thomas stood up, straightened his shoulders, walked to the witness stand with the bearing of a soldier. The bailiff swore him in. Thomas placed his hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth. "State your name for the record," Hartford said gently. "Thomas Reed, age 13. Thomas, you were one of 7 children auctioned by Judge Sterling in Clearwater last November. Can you tell the court what that experience was like?" Thomas looked at Sterling. The judge sat at the defense table, his face red with suppressed rage. For a moment, boy and man stared at each other, the abuser and the abused, the one who'd held power and the one who'd had none. Then Thomas spoke. It was like being an animal. They put leather collars on our necks, tied our hands, made us stand on a platform while men bit on us like we were horses or cattle. His voice was steady, strong. Judge Sterling ran the auction. He knew where we were going. Knew some of us would be worked to death. Didn't care. "Objection!" Sterling's lawyer shot to his feet. "The witness is speculating about my client's state of mind." "Overruled," the judge presiding over the trial said. "The boy may continue." Thomas turned back to Hartford. "My cousin Danny was sick. Had been for weeks. Judge Sterling knew. He tried to sell him anyway. Said a sick kid was better than no kid for people who needed workers." "What happened to Danny?" "Mr. McKenna bought all 7 of us. Took us to his ranch. Mrs. McKenna saved Danny's life." Hartford nodded. "And before the auction, where were you living?" "An orphanage in Rock Springs. They'd collected us from different places, some from trains, some from the streets. They kept us for a few months, then sent us to auctions in different towns." "Who ran the orphanage?" "A woman named Mrs. Carver, but Judge Sterling owned the building. He took a cut of every child sold." Sterling exploded from his chair. "That's a lie. I never owned any orphanage." The presiding judge slammed his gavel. One more outburst and you'll be removed from this courtroom." Hartford pulled out a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence deed records showing Judge Sterling's ownership of 3 properties in Rock Springs, including the building housing Carver's home for displaced youth." Sterling's lawyer went pale. The presiding judge examined the documents and nodded grimly. Hartford turned back to Thomas. "One final question. If Mr. McKenna hadn't purchased you and the other children, where do you think you'd be now?" Thomas looked directly at Sterling. "Dead, or wishing I was." The courtroom erupted, voices shouting, people crying, the judge's gavel pounding for order. Through it all, Thomas walked back to his seat with his head high. Silas pulled him close, and the boy finally broke. His shoulders shook with silent tears while his family surrounded him. The trial continued for 2 more days. More witnesses, more evidence, more proof of Sterling's corruption stretching back years. On the final day, Sterling himself took the stand. His lawyer tried to paint him as a misunderstood public servant, a man making difficult choices in an impossible situation. But when Attorney Hartford cross-examined him, the facade crumbled. "Judge Sterling, how much money did you make from orphan placements in 1,874 inches? I don't know the exact figure." "According to these financial records, you made approximately $15,000. Does that sound correct?" Sterling shifted in his seat. "If you say so. And of that $15,000, how much went to actually caring for the children?" Silence. "I'll repeat the question. How much money went to feeding, clothing, and sheltering the orphans in your care?" "These things are complicated. There are overhead costs, administrative expenses." "How much, Judge Sterling?" "Maybe $2,000. $2,000 out of $15,000. That leaves $13,000. Where did that money go?" "Various places, operating costs, legal fees." Hartford held up bank records. "Or perhaps it went into your personal accounts, perhaps into the new house you built, the horses you bought, the trips to San Francisco." "I'm entitled to compensation for my work." "You're entitled to nothing," Hartford's voice rang through the courtroom. "You sold children like merchandise. You profited from their suffering. You sent them to places where they'd be abused, neglected, and worked to death. And you did it all while hiding behind the respectability of a judge's robe." She turned to the jury, 12 men and women who'd listened to days of testimony, who'd seen the evidence, who'd heard Thomas Reed describe being sold like livestock. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense would have you believe Judge Sterling was simply doing his job. But selling children isn't a job. It's slavery. It's evil, and it must be punished." The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. The courtroom exploded again, this time with cheers. Sterling's face went white. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. Deputies moved in to take him into custody. As they led him away, he passed the row where Silas and his family sat. Thomas stood up, blocking Sterling's path for just a moment. "You don't get to hurt children anymore," the boy said quietly. "You're done." Sterling opened his mouth to respond, but the deputy pulled him away. The presiding judge called for order. When the room finally quieted, he looked at Silas and Clara. "Mr. and Mrs. McKenna, please approach the bench." They stood together, Clara's hand finding Silas's. They walked to the front of the courtroom with 7 children trailing behind them. The judge looked down at them with kind eyes. "The Territorial Court has reviewed Inspector Grimby's evaluation. We've heard testimony about your care of these children, and we've seen firsthand the transformation 7 traumatized orphans have undergone in your custody." He picked up a stack of papers. "Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that Thomas Reed, Samuel Cole, Elizabeth Hayes, Margaret O'Brien, Daniel Ward, Ruby Murphy, and Lily Murphy are hereby legally adopted by Silas and Clara McKenna with all rights and privileges of natural-born children." The gavel fell. Final. Absolute. The 7 children were theirs, not purchased, not temporarily placed, but truly, legally, permanently theirs. Danny started crying, then Lizzie, then the twins. Even Sam's eyes got wet, though he turned away to hide it. Thomas stood frozen like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Maggie walked up to the judge's bench. The bailiff moved to stop her, but the judge waved him off. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I want to say something." "Go ahead, child." 2 months ago, I couldn't talk. Hadn't talked in 2 years. Because the last time I used my voice, I called for my mama, and she didn't answer because she was already dead. The courtroom went silent. everyone leaning forward to hear. But then Mr. and Mrs. McKenna took us in. They fed us when we were hungry. They kept us warm when we were cold. They fought for us when everyone else wanted to throw us away. Maggie's voice grew stronger. They loved us when no one else would. She turned to look at Silas and Clara. They gave me back my voice, because for the first time I had something worth saying. She looked back at the judge. I wanted to say thank you, and I wanted everyone to know that families aren't just blood. Families are the people who choose to love you. She walked back to Clara, who pulled her into a fierce embrace. The courtroom erupted in applause. People stood, cheered, cried. The judge wiped his own eyes and adjourned the court. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was shining. Silas lifted Danny onto his shoulders. Clara held the twins' hands. Thomas, Sam, Lizzie, and Maggie walked together, finally relaxed, finally free. Where do we go now? Sam asked. Home, Silas said. We go home. They spent one night in Cheyenne in a hotel that let all 9 of them crowd into 2 rooms. The children had never stayed in a hotel before. They jumped on beds and ordered room service and stayed up late whispering excitedly about their new lives. Silas and Clara sat by the window watching the children play. You were right, Silas said quietly, about partnership being enough. Was I? When you first arrived, you said you couldn't promise love, just respect and commitment. You said maybe that was enough to build on. Clara nodded. I remember. I think I'm ready to build something more, if you are. She turned to look at him. Really look at him. This man who'd been a stranger 3 months ago, who'd become her partner, who'd fought beside her for 7 children, who needed them both. I think I'm falling in love with you, Silas McKenna. I think I'm already there, Clara. He kissed her then. Not the chaste press of lips from their wedding day, but a real kiss, deep and honest and full of promise. When they pulled apart, 7 children were staring at them from across the room. Gross, Sam announced. Romantic, Lizzie sighed. Does this mean we can call you Mama and Papa now? Danny asked. Clara's eyes filled with tears. If you want to. I want to, Danny said. Then louder, Mama, Mama, the twins echoed. Papa, Maggie said, the word still new and strange on her tongue. One by one the children claimed their parents with words they had never been allowed to use before. Thomas was last. He stood apart from the others, his arms crossed, his face carefully neutral. Then he walked over to Silas. Pa, he said quietly. That work for you? Silas pulled him into a hug. That works perfect. They traveled home the next day. The journey took 3 days by wagon, 3 days of cold but clear weather, 3 days of children arguing and laughing and being children. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested the final hill, and McKenna Ranch appeared in the valley below. The house looked smaller than Silas remembered, more weathered. But smoke rose from the chimney, and lights glowed in the windows, because he'd asked Doc Hartley to stop by and light the fires, to make sure the house was warm when they arrived, to make sure it felt like home. They pulled into the yard as the sun was setting. The children tumbled out of the wagon, racing toward the house, claiming rooms and arguing over chores and already planning tomorrow's adventures. Silas helped Clara down from the wagon. She stood looking at the house, her new home, and smiled. It's perfect. It's old and drafty and needs 100 repairs. It's still perfect. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had finally settled into quiet, Silas walked out to the small cemetery behind the barn. 2 headstones marked with Sarah McKenna and Rose McKenna. He knelt between them, his hand resting on Sarah's stone. I did it, he whispered. What you wanted. Filled the house with children, with life, with love. The wind rustled through the bare trees, peaceful, accepting. I'll always love you, you know that. But I love them too, Clara and the 7. They saved me like you wanted someone to save me. He stood up, brushing snow from his knees. So I hope you're okay with that. Hope you're smiling wherever you are. He thought he felt her then, a warmth in the cold night, an approval, a blessing. Thank you, he said to the darkness, for everything, for the years we had, for the daughter we raised, for leading me to this moment. He walked back to the house, to Clara waiting in the kitchen with hot coffee, to 7 children sleeping peacefully in beds they'd never have to leave, to his family. 25 years later, in the spring of 1899, those same children returned to McKenna Ranch. But they weren't children anymore. Thomas was 38, a rancher himself, with 3 children, Sam was 36, sheriff of Clearwater County. Lizzie was 34, a school teacher who specialized in orphaned children. Maggie was 33, a famous artist whose paintings of families hung in galleries across the West. Danny was 31, a doctor who'd opened a free clinic for poor families. And Rose and Lily, identical twins of 29, ran an orphanage in Cheyenne that treated children with dignity and love. They'd all come home for Silas's 63rd birthday. With them came 23 grandchildren. The ranch yard erupted with chaos and joy. Silas sat on the porch with Clara beside him. She was 57 now, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of laughter and worry. She'd never been more beautiful. 23 grandchildren, she marveled. How did this happen? You're asking me you're the one who kept feeding them. They kept coming back. She laughed and took his hand. They'd been married 25 years. Real married. Not just partners, but lovers, best friends. Two people who'd chosen each other and never regretted it. Thomas approached the porch, his oldest son in tow. "Pa, the kids want to hear the story about how you bought us." "I didn't buy you. You know what I mean." Silas looked at the crowd gathered in his yard. 7 children who had become 7 adults. 23 grandchildren who'd never know the suffering their parents had endured. A legacy built not on blood, but on choice. "All right," he said. "Gather around." They crowded close. Children sitting cross-legged in the dirt. Adults leaning against the porch rails. All of them waiting for a story they'd heard 100 times, but never tired of hearing. "It was November 1874, Silas began. "Cold enough to freeze your breath. I was riding through Clearwater when I heard a sound that changed everything, the sound of a hammer falling." He told the story, the auction, the 7 children on the platform, the moment he'd decided to fight instead of turning away. When he finished, his youngest grandchild, a boy of 5, tugged on his sleeve. "Grandpa, why did you save them?" Silas thought about that question, the same question he'd been asking himself for 25 years. Because someone had to, and because not saving them would have meant dying inside, and I was already half dead from grief, needed something to live for. He looked at his family, at Thomas's scarred face still visible after all these years, at Sam's badge catching the sunlight, at Lizzie surrounded by students who loved her, at Maggie's paint-stained hands, at Danny's medical bag sitting by the door, at Rose and Lily still finishing each other's sentences, at Clara, who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger and ended up saving them all. "They gave me a reason to live," he said simply, "and I gave them a place to belong. Seems like a fair trade?" Danny's son asked the question that always came next. "But how did you know it would work? How did you know they wouldn't run away or turn out bad?" "I didn't know. That's the thing about family. You don't get guarantees. You get choices. You choose to love, choose to stay, choose to fight when things get hard." He stood up, his joints creaking with age. "Blood doesn't make family. Choice does, love does, showing up every day and doing the work even when it's hard. That's what makes family." The sun was setting over McKenna Ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. 25 years ago, this place had been a tomb, a monument to loss. Now it was alive, full, overflowing with love and laughter, and the chaos of 3 generations learning how to be together. Silas stood on his porch surrounded by family and felt Sarah's ghost finally fade. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but released. Free to rest knowing he'd done what she'd asked. He'd lived. He'd loved. He'd built something that would last long after he was gone. That night, after everyone had eaten and the children had been put to bed in various rooms throughout the house, Silas and Clara sat alone on the porch one more time. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one." Even when Sam stole that horse when he was 15. He borrowed that horse. Even when Thomas got in that fight and broke his hand. He was protecting Danny. How could I regret that? Even when the twins convinced Maggie to cut all her hair off, Clara laughed. Okay, maybe one regret. They sat in comfortable silence watching the stars come out, the same stars that had watched over 7 traumatized children and 2 broken adults 25 years ago. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly. "For what?" "For stopping that day in Clearwater, for not riding past, for giving me a family when I thought I'd lost my chance at ever having one again." Silas pulled her close. "Thank you for showing up 2 months late, for fighting beside me, for loving those children like they were your own. They are my own. I know." They stayed on the porch until the last light faded. until the children inside stopped moving and the house settled into sleep, until the only sounds were crickets and the wind through the trees and the beating of two hearts that had learned to beat in time. Tomorrow their family would scatter again, back to their own homes and lives and responsibilities. But they'd return. They always returned, because this was home, not the house, not the land, but the love that had built something lasting from broken pieces, a family, chosen, fought for, worth everything. And in the morning when Silas woke, he didn't think about what he'd lost. He thought about what he'd found, 7 children who'd needed someone to fight for them, a woman who'd become his partner, and then his love. A life worth living, a legacy worth leaving. And that was enough. That was everything.